Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm with Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife, and we're thrilled to have you on this call tonight. And we have with us Kiley Briggs from the Orianne Society's Northeast Turtle Conservation Coordinator as his position. And what the Orianne is a nonprofit that focuses on conserving habitat for reptiles and amphibians. And it's really another important nonprofit that's out there that does this on research. Kiley grew up here in Vermont in the Champlain Valley, and he studied wildlife biology at UVM and earned his master's degree at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, where he studied how Texas tortoises change their habitat use at sites dominated by invasive grasses, which I would be very interested in learning more about. Since 2017, he's been leading the wood turtle monitoring and conservation program for the Orianne Society here in Vermont, and that's what he's going to be talking about tonight. We also have Tracy Karpoulos with us, who's going to be monitoring the chat box. We ask that you all mute yourselves so that we are able not to have background noises, dogs, kids, whatever, interrupting. If you have any questions, just type them in the chat box. And we look forward to hearing all that you have to share with us, Kiley. Take it away.
Great. So yeah, thank you all for coming and thank you for the introduction. So I'm here this evening to tell you all about the fascinating lives of wood turtles. I say fascinating, you'll have to decide for yourself at the end of this evening whether or not they truly are fascinating. And I'll be covering their ecology, conservation, and some other interesting tidbits about this particular species. Before I get started, I just have to give a shout out to some of our partners and organizations that have funded us over the years, in particular the Fink Family Foundation, the Canada Family Trust, and Vermont Fish and Wildlife have all been very supportive of our work since we got started here. And so just to give you an idea of the format for this evening, I'll just first spend a few brief minutes telling you about the Orianne Society and some of the work that we do outside of Vermont. And then I'll launch right into the wood turtles, spend a while talking about just their basic biology, threats to their conservation. And then I'll conclude things just by telling you all a little bit about what we can do as good stewards to help this species and restore habitat on any land that we may have some sort of influence on. So first, the Orianne Society. We've been around for since 2008, and the vast majority of our work is down in the southeastern United States. The reason that we were first founded was to launch this really large conservation program for eastern indigo snakes, which are this animal right here. This is the largest snake native to North America. Of course, they are dwarfed by the Burmese pythons that are invasive in Florida. But if you're talking about snakes native to the US, it's this one right here that is the largest. And the indigo snake has declined over many years for a variety of reasons, but a really big part of that is the decline of this particular species. This is the gopher tortoise. Gopher tortoises in the southeast are a true keystone species, which means that they create or modify their habitat in ways that many other species depend upon, and they do that by digging these really deep burrows in the ground, which is why they're called gopher tortoises. Over 300 species of vertebrates have been seen to use gopher tortoise burrows for one reason or another, and a couple dozen at least of those species really depend on the tortoise to survive. The indigo snake is one of those species, and gopher tortoises have really suffered as a result of well, habitat loss for starters, but also changes to their habitat through fire suppression. We as humans, we really don't like natural fires. Those fires cleanse the forest floor and sort of keep vegetation keep vegetation at bay. And in the absence of fire, the understory becomes very, very thick, blocks sunlight from reaching the forest floor. And then the tortoises can't really survive because the wildflowers and vegetation that they eat is harder to find. And once the tortoise disappears, all these other species, including the indigo snake, vanish as well. So a very big part of what we do in the southeast involves restoring fire to the landscape. We do that on a several thousand acre preserve that we own and operate, but we also work with private landowners to do prescribed burns on about 55,000 acres of nearby habitat. But that's not what I want to talk about tonight. That's sort of the brief intro to the Orianne Society. I obviously am not working down in the state of Georgia right now. As Lisa said, I grew up in Vermont. This is where I live. And at this point in time, I'm the only full-time Orianne Society staff member that works up here. I do have a seasonal technician that helps me out, who's now working on her master's degree at Antioch. But this is what I'm focused on. This is the wood turtle. So just to give you some rough idea of what these things look like, other than just showing you a picture, they have a black head, a brown shell. Sometimes that shell can have yellow markings on it. The shell is highly textured. If you look at the one in this picture, you can see these concentric rings around each of the plates or scutes of the shell, which are actually useful for helping age the animals, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But what I think the most brilliant thing about these turtles is that their neck and legs are bright orange. Sometimes they can be a little darker than this. This is a particularly bright individual. But when you find one of these turtles, it's that orange neck and legs that sticks out like a sore thumb and really catches most people's attention. And they get about 9 inches long, which is bigger than a painted turtle, but considerably smaller than a snapping turtle. Now, this is an example of one of the more brilliant colored wood turtle shells that I've seen. This was in the Connecticut River Valley. And this, I would say, is sort of on the extreme end of how much yellow these animals can have on their shell. If you flip this shell, the turtle over, you'll see that their belly, or the plastron, is yellow with these black markings in the corner of each of these plates or scutes. Those black markings function almost like a fingerprint. They're unique to each turtle. And just to give you an idea of where these things live, for the most part, the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada, as well as the Great Lakes regions where you're going to find wood turtles. And throughout this entire area, these species are in decline. They're considered globally endangered, but their actual protective status varies from state to state. In Vermont, they're considered a species of special concern, so not quite threatened, but not doing that great either. And there are a variety of reasons for that. And in Vermont, as well as New Hampshire, I would describe them as widespread, but uncommon almost everywhere they occur. So if I were to compare this to a painted turtle, which would occur in every single town in Vermont and probably New Hampshire, and they're very common everywhere, you might look at this map and say, oh, gee, wood turtles are all over the state. But if you go to each of these towns and start looking for wood turtles, you'll find that they are very difficult to actually locate and get your hands on. Many of these towns only have a single record of a wood turtle, and some of these towns might not have very many in them at all. So what do they need to survive? Wood turtles are really interesting if you compare them to any other turtle we have in the state, because they overwinter in streams. Our other turtles, at least the majority of them, are more closely associated with standing water, like lakes and ponds and like stagnant wetlands. So they overwinter in streams, flowing water, but then during the summer, they spend most of their time foraging on land. And that's what really sets them apart from the other turtles. So like painted and snapping turtles, if they're on land, it's because they're laying eggs, and that's pretty much it. But wood turtles are going to spend a lot of time foraging in floodplains and also in the uplands. And typically you might find them upwards of about 1,000 feet from rivers throughout the summer. And they may spend weeks on end up there without returning to the water. And during the winter, when they are in the water, they have pretty high oxygen requirements. That's actually why they overwinter in streams. Lakes and ponds sometimes have oxygen depletion during the winter. Wood turtles can't really deal with that. They have to absorb oxygen from the water directly. And if there isn't any oxygen there, they struggle to survive. So streams that are impacted by really high sediment loads or a lot of nutrient pollution that might have oxygen issues associated with them are going to be degraded and not as good for wood turtles. So if I were to design about an acre or two of wood turtle habitat, it would look something like this. So we have a clear bubbling brook flowing through the center of this photograph, a blown out beaver dam, which provides some structure for the turtles to hide in, a shallow pool with a lot of aeration right below this dam. That might be a good spot for the turtles to overwinter. Sand and gravel bars on the banks of the river. That's where the turtles are going to lay their eggs. They don't like to travel very far from streams to do that. And then surrounding this river, we have a floodplain. That floodplain can have a variety of different habitat types, but just the fact that it's a floodplain is really what these turtles are looking for. This one just happens to be a mixed sparse boreal forest. It could be meadow, it could be hardwood forest. It could be like an old cow pasture that's beginning to become reforested. That can vary quite a bit. So here's another example of wood turtle habitat. This is a floodplain wetland surrounding a river that you can't really see, that meanders back and forth through the center of this floodplain. And then surrounding that, we have a variety of wooded hills, hay fields. It's a whole bunch of things for the turtles to choose from, to choose between. And that's really a point that I try to make with this image, is that there isn't a single square foot visible in this photograph that might not be used by wood turtles at some point or another. Something that benefits their populations more than anything else is having a lot of different habitat types to choose from. And I throw this photo in here just as a demonstration of the sort of clean water environments that they do really well in. You might find them in more murkier settings, like, sedimented rivers, but in lower numbers. The sites where they do really, really well, and you find a lot of these turtles, tend to have very clear water. And when I'm looking for a place to survey for wood turtles, I usually start by looking at aerial images. And what I really look for are these streams that meander back and forth. They have lots and lots of twists and turns, and then visible sand and gravel bars at each of these turns, which would be the nesting habitat. And then so long as the habitat surrounding this river is a floodplain, then I'll consider that a good place to go look for these turtles. Noisy dog trying to interrupt me here. That's okay. So when these turtles are moving about the landscape and they're on land, there are a couple different zones that we think of where these turtles are going to spend most of their time. So even though they might typically range about 1,000 feet from a river, they're going to spend the vast majority of their time, or at least most of them will, within about 300 feet of the river, which is what this blue line, this blue boundary represents. And then yellow is 1,000 feet. And you'll have some turtles that travel much farther away from that, outside of that 1,000-foot zone, but 1,000 feet is really considered where the vast majority of the turtles are going to spend almost all of the time. So that's really the area that you want to focus habitat management for this species. And where they're going to spend most of their time isn't out in the middle of these hay fields. They're going to be, for the most part, sticking to not necessarily forested habitat, but habitat that has places to hide. And the middle of a cornfield is not going to be one of those places. They might use the edge of the fields and occasionally venture into the middle, but for the most part, they're sticking to areas that aren't being heavily used by humans. Oh, sorry, my mouse stopped working there for a second. Just moving on to their behavior a little bit. This is kind of an unusual picture of a wood turtle. It's very unlikely, if I'm just out there looking for wood turtles, to find one sunning itself right out in the open on the banks of a river. This one I had probably emerged from the river for the very first time early in spring, sunned itself for a little while, and then spent the vast majority of the rest of the year hiding, even when they're basking. So this is a more typical example of a wood turtle basking or sunning itself. So if you're just walking along this riverbank, not paying too close attention, you might not notice that there's actually a turtle hiding right in the center of this image. They'll find a place to tuck themselves under some vegetation, maybe the branches at the bottom of a fallen down tree, last year's goldenrod that's fallen over and is just laying on the ground, and they're just sticking their butt out. So if you're just walking by here, not looking, or if you don't know what you're looking for, this wood turtle is going to look more like a muddy rock sticking out from underneath some plants. It's not going to look like a turtle, so they can be very difficult to find. This is an example of a spot where I might go and look for wood turtles. At this particular site, I learned early on that during the early spring, when there really isn't any vegetation in the floodplain, it's all been stripped away by floods. These dead trees with a lot of vines around them are where the turtles are hiding. If I just go down here and start poking around the edges, I'll actually find the turtles hiding in those brambles. But someone just walking around that floodplain with a dog, maybe they're fly fishing or something, their odds of actually seeing this turtle are very, very low, unless it is on its way to its hiding spot and hasn't actually gotten there yet. Which is why when I'm looking for places to survey, or maybe introducing myself to landowners and trying to figure out places where I might be able to get permission to go and look for these turtles, something I hear quite often is along the lines of, well, I've lived out here for over 50 years, and if there were orange-legged turtles in my fields, I'd know about it. And on maybe 3 or 4 occasions after walking stream banks next to those fields with farmers, after finding 2 or 3 wood turtles in less than half an hour, their reaction is more or less along the lines of, well, I'll be dipped in manure. Very surprising to find these turtles after living and farming a property upwards of 50 or more years, to find out that there are turtles on their land that may have been living there that entire time. And when I say living there that entire time, I mean individual turtles that are the same age as that farmer. So speaking of age, one thing that's really cool about wood turtles and some other species, not all, is when they're younger, you can actually count growth rings on their shell and figure out how old they are within a pretty high degree of accuracy. So on each of these scutes, the plates on their shell, if you start counting these rings, each of these rings is going to correspond to a cold and heat cycle. So winter, we can count these rings to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This turtle's on its 7th year. But they only develop growth rings if they're growing, and they only grow for about 20 years. So once they're 20 or more years of age, all you can really say is this is an adult turtle and it's at least 20 years old, we think. However, something starts to happen to their shells as they get older, which is that over time, they're not growing anymore. Their shells start to wear down and there's like a smoothing that starts to happen. And over time, you lose those growth rings. They become very difficult to see until they get to this point where the shell is almost entirely worn down. There aren't any growth rings left. And while it's a little hard to say for certain, what we know is that that process should take about 70 years. And there's very credible evidence to suggest that these turtles probably live into their 90s. They may live even longer than that. Blanding's turtles, which are so closely related to wood turtles that they've been known to hybridize in captivity, have been confirmed in the wild at 88 years of age. And box turtles, which are another similar species closely related, have been confirmed to live over 100 years in the wild. And I don't have any reason to believe that wood turtles would be any different. And it wouldn't surprise me to learn that the oldest wood turtle in Vermont right now is older than the oldest human in Vermont. Of course, I'll never be able to prove that, but that's my educated guess. So wood turtles on stream banks sometimes leave tracks behind, which can be very useful, especially when you're looking for wood turtles in a place that doesn't have very many, and they're hiding, of course, but their tracks aren't hiding, and they'll stay there for several days or more. And if you were to compare turtle tracks to the tracks of any other animal, they're quite different because wood turtles, any turtle, has a shell in between their legs. So mammals, when they're walking across the landscape, they'll typically be placing one foot in front of the other, and you'll see their tracks more or less in a straight line, sometimes with a tail dragging down the middle in the case of muskrats and some other animals. But turtles, I think of them more as like little army tanks that are just driving around the rivers, leaving 2 rows of perfectly straight tracks separated by about the width of their shell, so 4 or 5 inches, maybe a little more. And quite often there will be this distinct tail drag down the center. And from that, can you tell wood turtles from painted turtles from snapping turtles? I believe that I can. But habitat is very useful because those other species aren't nearly as common in river settings. And then size, snapping turtles get huge, whereas wood turtles, if you see tracks about the size of a wood turtle on a stream bank, I feel pretty comfortable most of the time saying that's probably a wood turtle. And during the mid-spring to early summer, if you go to those nesting sites, the beaches, the sand and gravel beaches on the banks of the river, sometimes you see a lot of wood turtle tracks zigging and zagging across those beaches as the females look for places to lay their eggs. So speaking of reproduction, mating. Mating for wood turtles can take place on both land and in water. This pair just happens to be in the water. And while most breeding occurs in the spring and in the fall, it can occur pretty much any time of the year. The reason that it's more likely to occur in the spring and fall is because that's when all the turtles are in the streams and close together. During the summer, when the turtles have spread out across the landscape, it's a needle in a haystack, and the males will have a hard time finding females. So mating is just much less likely to take place. But spring and fall, they're all bunched up on the rivers, and you may find this event if you're lucky enough and are paying close attention and are just fortunate to see wood turtles mating. So I'm hoping this video will actually play for you. Wood turtles, when they're looking for a place to lay their eggs, it takes them a little while to find just the right spot. They might know roughly where they're going to lay their eggs, which beach or which sandy clearing up in the woods. But in terms of picking the precise spot, they're very, very thorough and can spend sometimes days or even a week going back to the same site again and again, zigging and zagging all over the place, looking for just the right spot. So this is a time-lapse video. I had game cameras here. Each frame is 1 minute, and you can see there are several turtles hanging out here, and it's the same 3 turtles here. At this particular, I think this is about a couple hours of footage. And here we have one, she's starting to dig a hole, her butt's wagging back and forth, but she doesn't really like it. She goes off, tries to find another spot. That's what we call a test hole. And here she goes, going again right here, same turtle, and she does actually lay her eggs this time. If we move on to the next slide, we'll see what happens later on in the year. So this is late August, early September, and these eggs begin to hatch. So watch the blue circle. Here they come. Now, these turtles were very fortunate that they lived long enough to hatch. The survival rate of young turtles is very, very low, and their egg survival rate is very, very low as well. And we'll have another nest emerging here in just a moment. All right, here comes round 2. Looking around for the first time, and off they go. And from here, it's just one turtle after another. All right, moving on. So life as a baby turtle is really rough. So I mentioned survival rates of eggs and young are incredibly low. That's because there are a lot of things out there that are going to eat baby turtles and the eggs of baby turtles. Pretty much anything that eats protein or high protein meals in nature is going to eat a baby turtle or its eggs if it can find one. Raccoons, foxes, skunks, otters, baby turtles to them are basically little Oreos scuttling about the landscape. They're not even all that hard on the outside. They're just a little bit crunchy. Their shell is nice and flexible. And then inside is like this nutritious protein bomb that is a highly valued treat to any predator. But not just the ones that you think of that I mentioned, but smaller ones as well. Blue jays, ravens, even chipmunks will happily make a meal of a baby turtle. So life is very rough, especially in that first year. But as they grow and as their shell becomes stronger, fewer and fewer animals are able to eat them until they get maybe 7 or 8 years old. And at that point, they have a really good shot of surviving until the age of 30 or 40 or even 60 if they can make it that long. From that point forward, they're pretty much going to live until something kills them. What do they eat? Wood turtles are opportunistic omnivores. They eat a little bit of everything, but their diet changes as they grow. So a young turtle is mostly eating high protein meals, snails, slugs, anything dead they can find, and just munching on a little bit of vegetation on the side. But once they stop growing, they mature, they've really converted to primarily herbivores that are just opportunistically foraging on high protein snacks as they find them. Especially in the early spring, they come out of those rivers and they seem to really be craving snails and slugs. And what we call it when we see a turtle like this that has bits of shell stuck to its face is a classic snail face. Or sometimes they'll have the slime of slugs just caked all over their face as well. So I wouldn't be talking to you tonight if there weren't some major problems going on with wood turtles and the prospects for their populations here in the state of Vermont and elsewhere. So there are a lot of different things that are threatening wood turtles. I'm just going to talk about the heavy hitters. What are the major threats that I think about when talking about these animals? So first and foremost, it's the changes we've made to the floodplains that they live in. This is a good example of what I consider former great wood turtle habitat. So we have the stream, but what is surrounding that stream? Those floodplains, the river valleys where wood turtles spend most of their time, have really highly nutritious soils, fertile soils, and are also very easy places to build roads. So as a result, most prominent wood turtle streams have a road on one side or the other, or both, and are quite often bounded on one or both sides by agricultural fields. And because the turtles are spending a lot of time on land foraging in that sort of open habitat, that unfortunately means that they're encountering cars and they're encountering tractors and the machinery being towed by tractors. So I want to give you just a heads up. The next image does depict 2 dead turtles. And if you aren't interested in seeing that, you can just avert your eyes until I say it's okay. So here we go. So these are the first 2 wood turtles that I found in the town that I live in now in northeastern Vermont. They were both found on the side of the same road, about a mile apart from each other. And in the past 4 years, I've actually only found 4 wood turtles in town, and these are 2 of them, which is not a great sign. I'm changing slides so you can look, hold on, you can look back now. It's a little harder to see the carcasses. So what does it mean when turtles are getting killed by cars or heavy equipment? So wood turtles, even in natural settings where they're not being killed by cars and tractors, I like to say their populations are just barely hanging on. They can't really sustain any additional mortality above what you consider natural causes of death. So when cars and tractors start whacking these turtles, it actually makes a really big difference. And what we know from some population modeling that was done a number of years ago is that from a typical wood turtle population, all it takes is about the loss of 1 turtle per year due to human causes for that population to begin declining. And losing 2 turtles per year can cause localized extinction within about 75 years, and 3 per year can cause localized extinction in about 50 years. That's not very much. And I'm like having a hard time trying to picture a wood turtle population anywhere that isn't losing way more turtles to cars and tractors, unless they're really out in the middle of nowhere. So here's your typical typical tractor in a floodplain setting. Hay fields are probably one of the major sources of mortality, but row crops like corn can be big as well. And it's not just the mowing equipment being towed by behind the turtles. They can be crushed by the tires themselves, which has some implications for what you might do to address that. And a lot of these turtles, when they get hit by mowing equipment, they can actually survive some pretty gnarly injuries. It's very common to find these turtles with very large, disturbing scars on their shells. This turtle was found near one of my study areas, and she may have been carrying that scar on her shell for upwards of 20 or 30 years, maybe even longer than that. We really have no idea, but she survived on her own without any sort of medical intervention. What we don't really know is how many survive their injuries and then how many actually die. Because when a turtle survives an injury like this, there's another 30 or 40 years that I might find it and see the scars. But if it's dead, the odds of finding the carcass over the next few months while that carcass is findable, very, very low. So we don't really know what % survive. This is one that I tracked last year using radio telemetry. So I glued a radio transmitter to its shell that allowed me to find the turtle using a radio receiver pretty much whenever I wanted. And at the end of last August, she was hit by some haying equipment, and she lost the edge of her shell right above her right shoulder. This is basically a superficial wound, obviously not ideal that she was hit by a mower, but she's still alive, and the wound isn't infected or anything. So it looks like she's out of the woods. She's going to make it. But this wasn't her first injury. You can't see it in this photo, but she's actually missing her left front foot. And she was like that when I found her at the start of last year. So this is a turtle that has seen some pretty horrific things and been through a lot. So I'm going back to this image, which is just showing a typical wood turtle stream surrounded by agriculture. The white zone in here, to remind you, is where wood turtles are going to spend most of their time, which is the river itself, and then the forested or unmowed fields surrounding that river. But then they'll venture into the edges of the fields themselves pretty regularly and forage in there. So this red area is what I would consider the strike zone, and that's where most turtles are going to be hit by equipment in settings like this. And we'll get to how you can address that in a few minutes. So shifting away from cars and agriculture and into some other threats to wood turtle conservation.
Kiley, we actually have a question.
Yeah, let's go for it.
From Marcel. Does nutrient loading from agriculture have any effect on the turtles?
Yes. So when hay fields or other ag fields get very close to rivers, a lot of those fields are fertilized with manure in the spring and summer, and a lot of those nutrients can run off into the rivers. And that causes a lot of issues that most of us will be aware of, like those blue-green algae blooms that might happen in lakes or in some coastal settings that are toxic to human health and really make it impossible to swim for certain periods. There are beach closures. But in the rivers, that same nutrient loading can have a very direct impact on oxygen levels in the winter, which can degrade or inhibit the ability of wood turtles to get the oxygen they need during the winter. And the same rivers that have really high nutrient loads often have really high sediment loads, so soil itself washing into the river that can actually cover the turtles in the winter and cut them off from oxygen, or at least frustrate their abilities to get the oxygen they need during the winter. So good question. So habitat loss, I know we have people here from all over the country, but I'll use Vermont as an example. Vermont, one thing I really like about this state is that we have really large tracts of relatively undisturbed habitat. If you go up to some of the ridges near my house and look around, once you get to the tops of the mountains, you can't actually see a single human structure. They're out there, but it's an area dominated by forest and wild habitat. But if you take all of these small scale developments, a housing development here, a shopping center there, a new cul-de-sac or cut across road over there, if you add all of those things up, the state of Vermont is losing an area equal to the size of the city of Burlington every 10 years. And that's not habitat loss that's going to be unlost later. And if you think about cutting down a patch of trees and clearing land, if you don't build anything there, that's going to turn back to forest relatively quickly. But when you build a shopping center, maybe it won't be a shopping center forever, but that is human habitat from that point forward in almost every single case. And it adds up. It takes away habitat that's available to turtles. And when these turtles are looking for places to nest, especially if they can't find what they need on the rivers, they're going to travel to places like this, residential areas, to try to lay their eggs, where females can be put at great risk. And invasive species are another really big one. So a lot of us are going to be familiar with Japanese knotweed, which is very good at colonizing riverbank habitat and can change nesting habitat into Japanese knotweed jungles. And if those nesting beaches don't have exposed sandy soils, then the turtles aren't going to lay their eggs there, because they'll know that there isn't enough sunlight for the eggs to incubate. And that's when the females will travel farther away from the rivers to lay their eggs, maybe crossing more roads or ending up in residential settings in the process. Or if this is a very flood-prone area and the vegetation gets stripped away in the spring, they might lay their eggs on this riverbank because it looks like a good spot to lay their eggs. And then by midsummer, it's a Japanese knotweed jungle again, and those nests just don't get enough sunlight, so they're not going to hatch. And turtle trafficking. This surprises many people. When you think about wildlife trafficking, I think most people think about like African wildlife, or in particular, like the ivory trade and elephants and rhinoceros, or monkeys, like small spider monkeys being collected from forests and sold in those like the wet markets that we've heard all about through the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's happening right here in the eastern United States, and a lot of that is focused on turtles. Several species, including wood turtles and a few others, are really highly sought after by poachers who will collect them from the wild and then sell them on an international black market. A lot of these turtles end up in Asia or the Philippines, but there's a small domestic market for them as well. And this is a very, very big industry. And remember, I mentioned it only takes the loss of 1 or 2 turtles from a population due to human causes to tip the scales toward eventual localized extinction. And a single poacher who really knows what they're doing can go to a single site during the right time of the year and collect 20 or more turtles in a single day, wood turtles. And that's something that a population just simply can't recover from, at least not in our lifetimes. That's a very devastating loss, which is why if you do see a wood turtle, or you know where a wood turtle population is, it's very important not to advertise the location publicly. The internet has been horrible about this. People who don't understand the problem might post a picture on Twitter saying, oh yeah, I found a wood turtle at such and such a park the other day. And suddenly that is public information. And these poachers are very good at using the internet to find new places to go and collect turtles. And it's not just deliberate, malevolent poaching as well. When people find turtles, they quite often will take it home for a little while, show it to the kids, keep it as a pet for a while. Maybe it gets released where it came from, maybe it doesn't. But a lot of those turtles never make it back to their habitat. And this one study really demonstrated sort of harm that can do to a wood turtle population. So I'm just going to read you a very short excerpt from the study abstract. And this was a site that had 2 very well-known, very robust populations. Throughout our study, the size of this forest remained the same, road building was restricted, and the quality of the air and water were constant. The wood turtle populations remained stable when people were denied access to the property. When this area was open to human recreation, just hiking and fishing, both populations of wood turtles declined steadily. The total number of wood turtles in both populations declined by 100% in 10 years. You can no longer find wood turtles at this location. Now, I'm not saying wood turtles and human recreation cannot go together. There are plenty of places in Vermont that have had human recreation and wood turtles for a very long time, and the wood turtles are doing fine. But this is just to demonstrate sort of the extreme of what can be done if certain areas are open to large numbers of people recreating. Subsidized predators. So raccoons and foxes, which I mentioned earlier, they do very well in places that have lots of humans. So especially around farms or suburban residential developments, you get lots and lots of raccoons. And even though they're getting fat off of garbage, they are still wild animals that are eating their natural wild food. And quite often their diet includes turtle eggs. And in places where the nesting habitat has been degraded and the turtles only know a few places to go lay their eggs, you might have most of a turtle population laying their eggs in only 1 or 2 or 3 spots. And raccoons figure out where those spots are and just hit them really, really hard and can completely wipe out the eggs and hatchlings at a particular site. And sometimes they're doing that every single year, so that even though nest survival is low in natural settings, it's almost zero in areas with a bunch of raccoons.
Another question for you, Kiley. Is the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas safe to tell about wood turtles, or will poachers search there?
That's a really good question. So the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas is a very important partner of mine. The atlas has been running since the early 90s. People submit observations to the atlas of just what reptiles and amphibians they see and where they are. And for most species, what's publicly available, what the atlas releases is a town distribution map. So you can pull up the map and see what towns have people seen wood turtles in. And for the most part, I don't think town level information is that damaging to wood turtles. If you look at the town distribution map, which I showed you earlier in this presentation, I think it's common knowledge that most towns with river valleys in Vermont have wood turtles. So just knowing that there's a wood turtle there doesn't really tell a poacher where the good places where there are lots of wood turtles, which are where they're looking to do their poaching. However, just to be on the safe side, very recently, the HERP Atlas changed its map for wood turtles so that it now only shows county level information, which is almost useless to a poacher. What the maps don't say is how many reports there have been, how many sightings. That would be very devastating information. And the Atlas's, Jim Andrews, who runs the Atlas, is very careful because he does get requests from researchers and biologists for information. And in some cases, he might send wood turtle information to those researchers. I myself am a beneficiary of his database, but he's very careful to make sure that this information isn't getting into the wrong hands. And most people get a very coarse level of information about where wood turtles occur, not GPS coordinates of streams that have a bunch of wood turtles. So good question. So shifting gears here, I want to tell you about what we can actually do to manage land to help the turtles. And I'll probably spend maybe 10 to 15 minutes on this topic, and we'll have a little bit of time for a more thorough question and answer session. But again, feel free to keep entering the questions into the chat, and Chasey will find a good time to sneak those in. So riparian buffers. This is a big one. So what's a riparian buffer? A riparian buffer is basically just a strip of land that separates area being managed and used by humans from water, in this case, rivers. A lot of times these buffers are going to be planted with shrubs, trees, and the idea is to create a hands-off zone where wildlife and plants are just allowed to flourish. And in most cases, these buffers are established for water quality issues. So as someone asked earlier about nutrients and sediments, when a cornfield or a hayfield gets right up to the edge of the river, those nutrients, especially from manure, go right into the river. But if there's a buffer to stop those nutrients, then that can actually go a long way to improving water quality. But a buffer that's established for water quality purposes might only be 50 or less feet wide. And as I mentioned, wood turtles are roaming 300 to even 1,000 or more feet away from streams. So here's an example of a river that has a riparian buffer in a Vermont river valley. And the buffer, I mean, you can barely even see what a 50-foot buffer looks like on here. It's not very much. And this yellow boundary shows you what a 1,000-foot buffer looks like. However, if I want to establish a bigger buffer here and restore the habitat for wood turtles, what do you think is going to happen if I knock on the door of this farmer and say, oh, hey, did you know that there are wood turtles on your farm and you shouldn't be haying within 300 feet of the river? What's outside of that 300-foot buffer? Steep hills, rocky habitat. This 300-foot zone in many river valleys, like that's the farmable land. And we need farmable land. Like I buy hay for my goats, and a lot of that probably comes from a river floodplain such as this one. But if I knock on the door of this farmer or give them a call and say, hey, I'm working on this wood turtle conservation program and I'm doing some monitoring. I'm just trying to figure out where are the hot spots for wood turtles. Would you mind if I just walk your stream banks and count turtles? Most people don't have a problem for that. And they're going to have a million questions because everybody likes turtles. And while you never know, some people just don't like anybody on their land. It's few and far between the cases where people tell me no. And once I get permission to survey this stream, I might say, oh, hey, and while I'm at it, would you mind if I just keep my eyes open for habitat restoration opportunities? You know, I know of some programs that can actually do some habitat management at no cost to landowners. And in some cases, you might even get paid or compensated for some of that work. At that point, you're framing the conversation in such a way that most people are going to be pretty receptive to. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get tractors out of that entire 300-foot zone. But if I can learn where the most important parts of this floodplain, where are turtles getting hit by tractors, then we can target restoration efforts to those areas or find alternative conservation strategies that can help reduce risk to the turtles and maybe even find some money to compensate farmers if that means taking a little bit of land out of production. So,
Kiley, another question for you. Is private forestry an industry that impacts much of wood turtle habitat in Vermont?
I'm going to save that because I have a slide. So before I move on from buffers, just a few notes. If there's anyone in this audience that manages land or does riparian restoration, so ideally, if you're managing a property for wood turtles, at 300 to 1,000 foot buffer zone is what you want to shoot for. But we all understand that's unrealistic in most cases. The bottom line here is the wider the buffer, the better, and like any buffer is better than no buffer. So you're just taking a step in the right direction, even if it's not 300 feet, is going to help these turtles. One thing that can help is planting shrubs in clusters, which can help recreate the sort of hiding places that the turtles will use in the early spring. So if you spread a bunch of shrubs out evenly throughout the planted buffer, it might take 15, 20 years for those shrubs to really establish and create places for the turtles to hide. But if you plant them in clusters, that structure is recreated very, very quickly. Well, much quicker anyway. And overall, the shrub species themselves aren't terribly important, but there are a few species that the wood turtles seem to really like. And one that really comes to mind is red osier dogwood, which you find in many places are the shrubs that these turtles are flocking to hide in during the early spring. So winter logging is a really big one for helping wood turtles. So that 300-foot zone, it's not just used for like standard agriculture, hay and corn or whatever. Most large tracts of land are going to have forested habitat, and logging is a very big resource to many landowners. And in that 300-foot buffer or 1,000 feet, if it's a place that's very important to wood turtles, a simple solution is if you've got wood turtles down there, just log during the winter. You are not going to crush a wood turtle with logging equipment if you're logging between November and mid-March. The turtles are in the river. They can't get crushed by a tractor when they're in the river. And there are certain logging practices that can actually be very beneficial to wood turtles. In particular, if you create small patch cuts near the river, that can create good foraging habitat, because what colonizes a patch cut? Raspberries and other things that wood turtles are likely to forage on. So yeah, limit logging within 300 feet to streams during the winter. One thing, if you're looking at an area that has a lot of human recreation, what happens to old logging roads after a logging operation is those roads become trails, and those trails attract people and ATVs, and that can be harmful to the turtles. So anything you can do to discontinue those roads and make it difficult for ATVs to get back in there afterwards, that's going to be a big help to the wood turtles. And again, those small patch cuts near the river can create good foraging habitat.
Question for you, Kiley.
Yeah.
What is the acre land requirement for these suggestions?
Like 0.1. I mean, the bigger the better. If I'm looking for places to achieve like a really big impact to wood turtles, the bigger the property, the better. If I can find a landowner that's got 1,000 acres and they want to put a buffer on their entire river frontage, that's a huge help to wood turtles. But a lot of times I'm working with conservation partners, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And they're often asked, like, what's the smallest property you're going to work on? Some land trusts have cutoffs, like they might not want to conserve a property that's less than 10 acres or whatever. But in many cases, we can find something to do on really small properties. There's the smallest one that I'm working on right now. We did some stream bank stabilization. It's just like a 3-acre property. And there are a couple other sites I'm aware of where smaller properties have been managed for wood turtles. So I don't like to think of things in terms of having a cutoff, but I love really big properties just because you can make if you've got a landowner that's willing, you can improve a lot of habitat all at once. But don't shy away from things if you've got more of like a postage stamp sort of parcel on a river or near a river. So restoring hydrology, I showed you, this is my floodplain habitat example from before, but looking from the top down. And this floodplain used to be hayed. And what happened back in the 1930s, 1940s is a drainage ditch was put in that drains the wetland, keeps it dry. It's not functioning very well right now. That habitat isn't being hayed anymore. What's the drainage ditch still doing there? It's not helping people anymore. So what's the point of it? Do the wood turtles need this to be a wetland? Not necessarily, but as I mentioned, the more types of habitat the wood turtles can choose from, the better it's going to be for the turtles. So why not plug this drainage ditch and restore the natural wetland? Restoring nest sites. So remember, sites with a lot of knotweed or sites that just don't have good sand and gravel bars on the riverbanks. You can either control the knotweed, try to knock that back, or in some settings, it might make sense to create new nesting habitat. And that can be as simple as just dumping a big old pile of sand near the river, and every few years or so, just maintaining that and keeping vegetation from encroaching. And a study done by Kurt Buhlman and a few of his colleagues a number of years ago looked at, if they build it, will the turtles come? And the answer is yes. Wood turtles will find this habitat. It might take them a couple years, but they did this fascinating thing where they actually went out and found some female wood turtles nearby and stuck them, just put them on this new nesting habitat. And the turtles that were put on that nesting habitat returned the very next year to lay their eggs. But the ones that weren't shown the habitat, it took them a few years to discover it. So even though that turtle might have been confused about being picked up and brought to this random pile of sand that wasn't there before, they remember the spot and they went back the next year, which I think is just fascinating. And hand in hand with that nest site management is invasive species control. And I'm in particular thinking about knotweed, but there are plenty of others. Knotweed can be very difficult to eradicate from a property. And unfortunately, usually the best tool at our disposal is the use of herbicides, but there are plenty of options out there used by conservation organizations, such as Roundup derived products, glyphosates, which aren't ideal. But when it comes to using glyphosate versus keeping the knotweed is by far the greater evil. And using herbicides to control that knotweed isn't going to have a negative impact on the animals here. And if you do this in the fall, and it can be targeted really just to the knotweed, you're taking a huge step in the right direction. And even though it might be almost impossible to eradicate knotweed from a 1,000-acre property, if you just get it off the nesting beaches, which is feasible, that's tangible, that's easy to accomplish, you can have a huge impact on the wood turtle population. When you're doing that sort of invasive species control, a very important factor to consider is if you have to get ATVs down there, that's not something you want to do when the turtles are active. And you really want to avoid, even on foot, disturbing the nesting habitat while the turtles are laying their eggs and also while the eggs are present. But after early September, you're pretty much good to go. And that's really the best time to control for knotweed anyway. So just do the management in the mid-fall, and you can really limit the sort of impact you might have on the wood turtles themselves, apart from just helping them. And then recreation planning. So as I mentioned, recreation, even though there are plenty of sites where wood turtles coexist with recreation, there are examples where recreation has been a very big harm to wood turtles. So just keeping trails, if there are new trails being installed, keeping them outside of that 300-foot zone to the greatest extent possible is a really good idea, and especially avoiding the nesting habitat. And unfortunately, those nesting beaches are often the sorts of places where humans want to have their picnics or go swim on the river. There's one property where the best that I work on, where the best possible nesting beach is just used by humans all summer. But there are other sites nearby where the turtles can nest. So the management strategy we've adopted there is this one beach, that one's for the humans, but these others we're not putting trails near, and we're trying to make it harder for humans to access so that the turtles can do what they need to and they're not impacted or having domestic dogs dig up their nests all the time. ATVs are probably a bigger problem, just footpaths, especially when ATV trails get in your nesting habitat, because when the turtles are roaming around and going to sandy sites to lay their eggs, if there's like a sandy clearing near a river and there's an ATV trail that crosses or gets really close to that sandy opening, sandy habitat is very attractive to the off-roading crowd, and to the greatest extent possible, trying to keep ATVs off of that sandy habitat when it's within 300 feet of rivers is just hugely beneficial, because even worse than losing turtle nests to an ATV collision or just being like torn up by the tires is losing an adult turtle, which is just very, very bad. So just a few extra notes here before we wrap things up. I think many of you, when you're out there in the woods, near streams, or working on properties, you might find wood turtles on occasion. And many times I have people email me or text me a picture of a turtle, and they're like, oh, hey, I found this wood turtle, and it just happens to be a place that I'm studying, but it's a picture of the top of the turtle. And while it's great to know, okay, that person found a turtle and that's useful information, if you can get a picture of the bottom of the turtle, that can help someone like me actually recognize and say, hey, I saw that turtle. I know what turtle that is. I know where it nests. I know where it overwinters, and now I know where it spends the summer. Very useful information. And just as an example of that, these pictures are from a site where I'm not marking turtles, which is a method myself at many sites will use a metal file to create shallow grooves around the edge of the shell to identify individual turtles. At this particular site, we're not doing that. We're only using photo documentation of the bottom of the shell to identify turtles. And here we have an example of the same turtle. These photos were taken about a year apart from each other. And you can just look, it's a perfect match. If you're comparing the shape of these black blotches, it's like a fingerprint. So very, very useful to get a picture of the bottom of the shell. And I've had a few examples of people who have sent me pictures of turtles they found near places where I'm working, where I've then been able to cross-reference those images and say, hey, I know that turtle, which is just really fun. And not just for me, but for the person that found the turtle.
A question for you, Kiley. What is the best thing the average person can do to help the wood turtle population?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think one of the best things we can do is just be informed and conscious stewards of the land, and just be very conscious of the sort of impact we have when we're going into these animals' habitat. Just something that I think about sometimes when I'm walking in riverbanks is we as humans, we leave a lot of stink behind, and that stink attracts predators. So if you plunk your butt down on a nice wood turtle nesting beach and sit there for a while, where's the raccoon going to spend its time later? It's going to be around where you spent time. But when I think of what we can do as private citizens, I think the biggest things that we can do is if we're fortunate enough to own or manage land, is to just set aside some of that land, especially near rivers, and think of it as wildlife habitat and not an area that we're using for our own benefit, although we might very much enjoy that habitat. And also making contributions to organizations that do habitat restoration. One thing that I always plug is, at least here in the state of Vermont, we have a program called the conservation plate. So a lot of states will see conservation license plates, and in Vermont, all of the money that's raised by those conservation license plates goes into habitat and water quality habitat restoration projects. And the Orianne Society has been one such beneficiary of what they call watershed grant funds that are funded by those license plate sales. And that money has allowed me to fund a seasonal technician to help me do wood turtle monitoring for a couple years in a row. So that I think is very important. Just think about if you're going to make a contribution to a conservation organization, what's the work that they're doing and what sort of impact can that money have? So speaking of habitat restoration programs, Sorry, my dog has decided now's a great time to make a lot of noise. Guys, Boomer, hey, don't do that. He's cool, but he's just noisy. So conservation programs, who's out there doing habitat restoration in the state of Vermont, and some of these are multi-state as well. Really one of the biggest tools or biggest programs we have are associated with the United States Farm Bill. The NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, is one of our biggest partners. They do tons and tons of habitat restoration projects in river valley settings and other settings as well, but especially on working landscapes, farms, forested settings that are being used for commercial harvest. That's the sort of places that they want to work. But they're also the ones that have the money to reimburse landowners and pay them for doing some of that habitat restoration, or at the very least covering the bill so the landowner doesn't have to pay for invasive species control or establishing a riparian buffer. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been a huge help. They're very flexible in terms of the types of properties they can work. It doesn't need to be farms. It doesn't even need to be privately owned. And the sorts of practice they can do are very case by case. And we've done some pretty creative things with them. Vermont Fish and Wildlife and the Agency of Natural Resources, obviously a huge help to us, and I work very closely with them on a variety of projects, and they're also the ones administering those watershed grant funds. But then you get into the non-governmental side, so nonprofit organizations and land trusts like the Vermont Land Trusts, the Northwood Stewardship Center, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, Vermont, the Connecticut River Conservancy, just lots and lots of organizations out there. And I've partnered with many of these NGOs on various projects. Sometimes they're the ones that have the landowners that they're already working with. They're just directing me to places that they think might be good to do some wood turtle work. Sometimes they're the ones doing the habitat restoration. Sometimes they're the ones just paying for it. So there's a lot of people and a lot of organizations involved. And my role in all of this has really been to figure out where are the important places for wood turtles in Vermont so that we can target efforts being done by all of these different organizations to the places where money spent to restore wood turtle habitat can have a really big impact. Because if just hypothetically, if we had $1 million to blow on wood turtle habitat restoration here, we could spread that out all over the entire state and do 60 small projects and not make a really big difference to a single wood turtle population. They're all still declining. They're all still going to be gone in 75 years or however long it's going to take. So what have we actually done? What if we pick 5 or 6 spots that are really important and represent sort of the entire range of wood turtles throughout the area, and then target those efforts to those 5 locations? We could actually fix the problem at those 5 locations over a 20 or 30 year period and stabilize wood turtle populations so that they'll still be there 300 years from now. So just a couple examples of restoration projects. I'll be real quick through these. This is a program in the works right here. So this is a small farm. They have about 6 acres of hay field, about 7 acres that they've been haying, at least since they've owned the property. Down in the river, some parts of the river have a riparian buffer, other parts do not. The hayfield gets right up to the edge. And in partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Natural Resource Conservation Service, we'll be doing some riparian plantings, establishing shrubs here in a few locations. And then along the edge of the field, remember I mentioned that the turtles like that early successional, the edge habitat, what's between the buffer and the field. In this zone, bounded by the orange polygons, this is an area that is only going to be mowed in the late fall. So after the wood turtles return to the river, that's when this will get cleared, so that the edge habitat is maintained, but it's not being mowed when the turtles are present. And actually, my technician right now, Mel Laurer, who's now working on her master's degree at Antioch, something that she's going to try to solve through her master's research is how wide should that area be? It doesn't need to be 50 feet wide, 30 feet wide. We don't really know the answer to that question. So her research, I think, will be very helpful in terms of planning projects like this in the future. And what I really like to end things with is saying that wood turtles are great ambassadors for conservation. This is a family, actually they're the family that live on the site being managed in that last slide. And what you're looking at a picture of is this entire family seeing their very first wood turtle. This is a couple years ago. This just blew their mind when they found out they had wood turtles on their land. The kids end up starting what they call the Turtle Club. And in addition to the fact that people just like turtles, the reason why wood turtles make great ambassadors for conservation is because they depend on access to and connectivity between rivers and uplands. So wood turtles are kind of like a proxy for ecosystem restoration that benefits all sorts of flora and fauna within river valleys. So managing habitat for wood turtles and thinking about it on a landscape scale can really help create a boon to biodiversity. And these same restoration practices help clean the water by reducing soil and nutrient pollution, which improves recreational opportunities for humans, such as swimming and fishing. And because people like turtles, trying to pitch conservation to help turtles is a much easier sell than, say, trying to pitch conservation for rattlesnakes, which I also do. And that's this whole other story. So, and this is the turtle they're all looking at. And the last thing I want to say is here in the state of Vermont, we're really in a special area. If you look at the wood turtle range throughout the northeastern United States, this image on the left shows where wood turtles are now. Brown areas, not so great, but they're there. But the darker sort of bluish and green areas, that's the core of the range. That's where the wood turtles are doing best today. What are things going to look like in 50 or 100 years after climate change? I don't think the wood turtle range in its entirety is going to contract very much, but where the turtles are able to do really well and where their strongholds are will contract in the face of a warming climate. And what's the core of their habitat going to be 100 years from now? Look at this map and look at where Vermont is. Vermont is smack dab in the middle of what's projected to be the best habitat for wood turtles in a warmer future, which makes conserving habitat for wood turtles here even more important. So with that,
Kiley.
Yeah.
Are there elevation limits to their distribution?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't find very many wood turtles up above about 1,000 feet. But the reason for that isn't so much that they're up at a high elevation. It's just that when you're at those higher elevations, the terrain is much steeper. So there aren't really those floodplains and river valleys where the wood turtles can survive. So it's just that the habitat isn't likely to occur at higher elevations. But if there's a river valley through like a high elevation plateau, I can't think of a reason why there couldn't be wood turtles there. So I'll just wrap things up by saying, every property is different. What each landowner needs from their land is different, and how the wood turtles use that land is going to be different. So wood turtle conservation is very case by case, and a one size fits all approach doesn't necessarily work in every case, which is why I personally feel very fortunate to be in a position to be working with landowners to find creative conservation strategies that fit for their particular properties. And this last set of pictures shows a wood turtle that's missing a leg. It's pretty common to find turtles missing legs. Raccoons may cause this. Sometimes haying equipment can cause that. Sometimes I find wood turtles that are missing 2 legs, or they have a really bad scar on their shell. My point here is that they're able to survive tremendous stress. They are incredibly resilient animals. What they haven't been able to survive are changes to their habitat. That's been the death knell to wood turtle populations. So moving forward, anything we can do to make things a little easier for these animals and give them the space they need, that's what's going to make the difference for making sure this species can still be here 300 years from now. So that's what I've got for you. And hit me up with any questions you have. I'm ready.
All right, we have a few coming up. Just curious why not remove the invasive plants from the area once they're pulled, etc. The slide said to leave them on site.
Oh, yeah. So I realized I was talking too long, and I kind of sped through a few things. So in particular, that was in regards to sites where you might be removing invasive shrubs like common buckthorn, glossy buckthorn, honeysuckle. Those are all shrubs that you might find really close to rivers. And if you're trying to restore habitat and get native shrubs back there, you might want to remove those shrubs. Wood turtles don't really care if most shrubs are native or invasive. And honeysuckle actually creates really nice hiding habitat for the turtles. You'll find them quite often wedged under the branches of honeysuckle. But if you want to remove those shrubs and then restore native vegetation, there's going to be a period of time between when you remove the honeysuckle and when the native shrub's established, when the turtle suddenly doesn't have a place to hide. So the simple thing there is just kill the shrub, cut it down, leave it there, and then that shrub's carcass will provide structure for the turtles to hide in for the several years it takes for the native shrubbery to replace it. And sometimes you might not even cut it down. You just girdle it or treat it with like a topical herbicide, like kill it dead and leave it there. And the turtles will use that for as long as the stump and branches are remaining. But then the native shrubs have a chance to come back.
All right, next, Pennsylvania has a head starting program for some species. Is there a similar program for Vermont?
Oh, yes, I was waiting for the head starting question. So for anyone who doesn't know, head starting is a fairly common method of turtle conservation and other reptiles. And what it means is either having wild turtles lay eggs, or basically you can either collect eggs from the wild or breed turtles in captivity and then rear the young and then raise the young, release the young at a larger size. So if you're collecting eggs in the fall or summer, hatching them to captivity and then releasing them in the spring, that baby turtle at that point has been kept in captivity and fed all winter. It's growing through the winter, whereas normally they're not growing in the winter. So by the time spring rolls around and they've been fed a high protein, like captive diet, they're the size of like a 3 or 4 year old turtle. And then they're released. And at that point, their odds of survival are a lot better than that hatchling turtle that's just needing to figure things out on its own. And there are places where that makes sense. And I can think of, Pennsylvania, there are other states doing a lot of head starting. In Vermont, we're not doing any head starting for wood turtles. And one reason for that is even though head starting can be very effective at addressing certain problems. So if the problem is nest and hatchling predation by too many raccoons, but the adults have the habitat and things like haying have been addressed, then maybe it makes sense to do something to help the hatchlings if you can't restore the habitat easily. But if the money you're spending to do a head starting program means you're not establishing riparian buffers and you're not protecting the adults, then that money might be spent in the wrong place and you could get better bang for your buck focusing those funds on habitat restoration. But there are examples. So in Vermont, there is one head starting program, not for wood turtles, but for soft shell turtles on northern Lake Champlain. And that's a situation where it's the nesting habitat that's the problem. There are like 2 beaches in the entire lake where soft shell turtles still nest, and they're both just hit really hard by predators. So without human intervention, those nests just aren't going to make it. But we're not there yet with wood turtles in Vermont. There might come a time where we have a specific site where it makes sense to do head starting. But there are also factors to consider, like making sure that you're using turtles that are genetically appropriate. So you wouldn't use a turtle from like genetic stock from the Midwest to do a Head Start program in Vermont. There are lots of factors to consider. So head starting great, but no, we're not doing that for wood turtles at this point in time. Other people are. All right. Any other questions before we say goodnight for the evening? I imagine I see a lot of things in the chat.
Yeah.
Tracy was muted for a moment.
Oh,
Tracy,
sorry.
you got a few more to ask? Let's just take a few more and we can wrap up at 8:15.
Yeah, right. And I will. I'm going to back up to a slide that had my email address in it so that you all have that. But yeah, Tracy, feel free to read the question while there's my email.
Can you legally keep a wood turtle as a pet in Vermont or anywhere else in the USA?
So pet turtle laws vary from state to state, but every state in which wood turtles are native, they are protected. So you're not supposed to keep them in captivity. I know there are plenty of examples where people do. And that's usually when someone just finds the turtle crossing the road and doesn't realize the harm they might be doing by taking it home. So no, anywhere that wood turtles are native, you can't keep them in captivity. In the state of Vermont, all of our native turtles are protected, but that's not the case in every state. But if you go to an area like California where wood turtles are not native, they're in fact somewhat common in the pet trade, and you can buy them at pet stores, just not where they're native.
Eileen?
Yeah, Mark, go for it.
Hey, how you doing? All right, two-part question, really two unrelated questions, but one's pretty quick. The duration from the first hatchling coming out of the nest to the last, on average.
Oh yeah, good. So I've only first we'll applaud Mark for knowing how to use the chat box. Sorry, I like making fun of Mark a little bit, but it's not deserved. Mark's doing great things for turtles anyway. So yeah, how long does it take all the young to get out of the nest? I don't really know. The time lapse photos that videos that I showed earlier. I'm kind of guessed. I didn't actually measure the amount of time, but it seemed like maybe about an hour for each nest to finish. So but it's not like you'll have one turtle hatch and then an hour later another one comes. Like once they're ready to go, they all go. And that's a strategy used by many turtles because the predators know when it's baby turtle season and they're just going to hang out and pick those turtles off one by one, which was easy if they're all coming out one every hour. But if they all come out at once, some of them are going to make it down to the river.
I gotta say, I'm amazed because I have moved a few nests over the years, and it's been like a week. Because I'm just not a good turtle mom. Basically, I can put them in the ground somehow. Some of them hatch, but seriously, I've gone and checked, and after some emerge, others are definitely not ready. So, okay, hey, do me a favor. Can you show me that side by side of the plastron 1 year apart?
Yeah, well, Tracy, while I'm pulling up this other slide for Mark, why don't you hit me up with the next question?
Well, this is actually,
All right, let me see.
Or sorry, this is part of it. This is part of his question.
That's part of it.
It's going to take
Yes,
me a minute to
thanks.
find the slide. So Tracy, let's.
I just want to share this because it's an amazing turtle in this sense. You got to get to it, right?
Yeah, right here.
Thanks. No, that's small right now. Yeah, right. This turtle has so much Rorschach going on in terms of, like, I see somewhere, I see sort of a kissing hog. You see the kissing hog on the left. Lower right is that like a growling. I want to say,
Yeah, I've never done that. Like trying to looking at clouds, trying to figure out like what the turtle's pattern remind me of.
A lot of turtles have one animal that you can see out of all. This one's, it seems like every other. There's a lot going on there.
I might have to start naming turtles based on what their bellies remind me of. All right, Tracy, hit me up.
Thanks.
All right. What invasive species would cause the most harm to wood turtles?
So, I mean, the big one that I think about is Japanese knotweed, just in terms of its impact to the nesting habitat, which is probably the biggest impact a plant can have on a wood turtle. But as far as other invasive species, yeah, I mean, I guess they're not invasive, but I think I almost think of like subsidized predators as being like on the same level as invasive species in the sense that there are just way too many of them, and they're having a big negative impact on the turtles. But as far as plants, like number one culprit is going to be Japanese knotweed.
All right. And do you receive mostly positive responses when trying to work with landowners when it comes to surveying for wood turtles?
Yeah, for the most part, and it's really helpful to develop a good relationship with that one landowner that everybody in town knows. And if that person doesn't like you, then you're off to a rough start. But what happened a few years ago when I was first starting this project, I was doing wood turtle surveys in a lot of places where I didn't know the people. I'd never stepped foot on the river before. I was just cold calling people who I thought might have good habitat and asking them out of the blue, hey, can I go look for turtles? And I left a lot of voicemails because these days everyone screens their calls. And the people who actually picked up their phones and who I spoke to, I would say 95% said, yes, go ahead. And that 5% that said no, half of them warmed up to the idea after I started dropping neighbors' names. Like, oh, the Jeffersons are letting you on their river? Well, I guess it'd be okay to come on down while you're at it. But as far as the people that never called me back, I have no idea if they just thought the whole thing was stupid and that they don't like turtles or conservation, or if they just didn't get around to it, or I had the wrong number. So the people that don't call you back, you just never know why that is. But if you can actually speak to people, by and large, I've had pretty positive interactions. One thing that can really taint that sort of conversation is if a landowner has had prior experience, especially with the government that they didn't really care for. I find it really helps just working for a nonprofit, because some people just don't like the government, and it doesn't matter what you're trying to do. If you work for the state or the feds, you're just not going to have an in with that landowner. But plenty of people love the government, so that helps too. All right.
All right, do we have time for one more? Or
I'm going to keep going, but yeah, maybe let's do one more, and then
All right,
I'll go back to my email slide, just so people can follow up if they want.
Okay, last one. What variables limit their southern range? Is it temperature?
Yeah, temperature I think is going to be a big one, and temperature affects a few things. One of the things that temperature impacts is oxygen availability in the water. So the warmer a stream is in the winter, the less oxygen it has. And if you go down to Florida, I mean, I don't know what the oxygen cutoff is, but I think that's a big limiting factor in terms of where these turtles can survive is oxygen levels in the winter. And I mean, the way they survive the winter is really quite remarkable. They don't come up and breathe air. They can be in a river that's like pretty much entirely iced over, and they're absorbing oxygen from the water directly through the roof of their mouth and the lining of their cloaca, which is a fancy way of saying they breathe through their butt. But there needs to be oxygen in the water for them to do that. Painted turtles and snapping turtles have some remarkable adaptations that help them survive the winter, even in a mucky pond that has no oxygen at all. Painted turtles have been able to survive in laboratory studies over 130 days in a row with zero oxygen, and they survive by metabolizing glycogen in their muscle tissue instead of oxygen. And that creates acid buildup in their blood, which kills most animals. But those painted turtles they'll leach calcium out of their shell to buffer that acidity. Wood turtle can't do that. So they are absolutely dependent on that high oxygen level in the water in the winter. And I just feel like those southern rivers don't have it. It's not enough.
Well, that's all really interesting. I learned so much tonight, Kiley. Thank you so much.
Nope, you're very welcome.
You know, it's true. Habitat is key to so many things, water quality, you know, those keystone species that you talked about right in the beginning. It's all connected, and we really appreciate those of you who are landowners who take the time to care about these critters and do something on your property positive for it. You can contact Kiley through the Orianne Society and learn more if you think you might have some wood turtle habitat on your property and you'd like to try and do something. You can contact Vermont Coverts, and we're certainly willing to help you hook you up to other programs that are available for controlling invasives through NRCS and putting you in touch with the right people if you're looking to do something on your own property. It's been great to spend some time with you all tonight.
And if you don't live in Vermont, but want to know where to send your wood turtle observation data as well, don't email Vermont Coverts, email me. I'll figure it out. I know these people.
That's right. Everyone's connected. It works out good. Tracy, thank you for monitoring the chat box. Kiley, thank you for the presentation. Everyone, thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Great. And sorry again for the confusion
Thank
about
you,
the start time. So have a good night, everybody.